So as I said, this is the class on cabin fever, something that we're all experiencing a lot of when we're in the isolation phase. And as a psychologist, I'm very interested in predictable things that can happen and will happen when there's stress and anxiety. And I thought that given a class like this would help people soothe and relax if they remembered what their practices are, what other people are doing. And the main thing is when there is stress and anxiety, all of us are experiencing a tremendous amount of change. You know, there's change in finances, there's change in shopping, there's change in who we meet. And all those subtly affect our identity, our sense of ourselves. And those changes also then have an impact on our reactivity. I know a lot of us, myself included, feel vulnerable, can react quickly to things, sometimes in a good way, feel very open-hearted to people, or at other times very shut down. So all of our reactions and our communication patterns are exacerbated in times like this. And I usually see couples in similar times when there's extra stressors, extra anxiety. So this is like that on top of that, on top of that, on top of that. So we can all expect that vulnerability, that anxiety, the feeling of uncertainty, purposelessness, I've noticed from some of my clients. And so today we want to talk about how you can cope with that, how you can deal with that better. And I'm not immune from any of this. I mean, I was sitting this morning, I was getting ready for the talk, and I had this wave of anxiety, like, what do I know? Like, people have sent in the most interesting and powerful questions that kind of like rocked my spiritual world. And I was like, what do I know about that? So then I just had to stop and go, well, at 4 o'clock, they're all going to be here. And at the same time, you know, I started to feel like each one of you, like my heart and my consciousness extended out to each one of you in this moment of connection. And I thought, you know, that's something else that bonds us. It's not just the sense of anxiety or depression or isolation that many of us are experiencing, but there's also some union that we experience, some unity around spiritual practice and the idea that by attending to ourselves more mindfully, we can get better. We can deal with our anxiety. We can deal with our reactions. So when I felt that, I felt this feeling of connection. I mean, there's people on the call from different states. But even so, they felt very close to me because of that unity experience of feeling like we all have some sense of growth, some sense of the Dharma, some sense of development. And then right after I felt that, I just felt some compassion. I felt compassion for all of you and for myself. Here I was, anxious, having my own issues arising. And I felt this feeling of warmth and compassion, like, here I am, you know, doing my best, all of us doing our best. So the thing that's important about that is that meditation I was doing, that sense of Sangha or reaching out to others and feeling their power, their connection, their suffering, that's a spiritual discipline that many of us are practicing now. And then the last part of it was this feeling of compassion. Like, it's almost like that arising of compassion follows almost immediately from feeling connected with others. So I want to talk a little bit more about that later. But the other thing that is parallel to what's happening is in our relationships, we can pretty much predict that what I lovingly call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I describe as attacking and defending and pursuing and withdrawing, are more likely to arise now. Those are the basic patterns that arise when we feel stressed or reactive or isolated. And it's kind of like, that's what we do, okay? Many people I know, and including myself, like, I'm not defensive, I'm not withdrawn, but yeah, you are, get it, you are, we all are. So what's interesting about that is, number one, this is the water that we swim in. This is how we've seen all our lives people react to stress and conflict. So you see the pursuing, withdrawing, and you see the attacking and defending. And of course, the reason my 2 fingers are up is because these two things usually go together. You know, the attacker attacks, the defender defends. The pursuer pursues, the withdrawer pulls away. And these systems amplify. The more the pursuing goes on, the more the distancer, the withdrawer pulls away. So that's something to be mindful of. Am I going into one of these predictable patterns? And several of the questions that were turned in about these patterns talked about the pursuing and the withdrawing. So I wanted to say a couple of quick things about that. So in psychological theory, the pursuing and the withdrawing are really called symptoms. They're like the behavior that you see, but there's something deeply internal going on for each person when those behaviors are happening. So those behaviors are the expression of some deeper feeling. And that investigation is what you call mindfulness. It's an inquiry into your own reactions. So one other tool, I've already mentioned compassion meditation. I've already mentioned meditation. Inquiry, asking yourself, how did I arise here? How did I arrive at this kind of reaction? Can be very healing. So if, and as I've said to a lot of couples also, I'm expert at all of them. I have like a PhD in all 4 of these methodologies. I'm in my 70s. I've done them all like hundreds of times. I know them very well. So the point is that if you think about the withdrawal is a protective space. The withdrawal is a state that arises when somebody feels threatened. So that may not be conscious to the person. They may be saying, I need some space, I need to pull away, or they might just shut down. And in these times, when people are feeling so vulnerable, so anxious, so out of sorts, so confused, the withdrawing can obviously occasionally be amplified by these other preconditions. But if you think about why would a person feel threatened, it's because there was something very threatening, most likely, in their environment when they were a child. And so their methodology of getting away from that threat, whether it was a parent or a sibling or a teacher, we don't know. But generally, it's a threat. And then what happens when you feel threatened? You're feeling fear. So the fear there is of being overwhelmed. Now, I'm stating this in some generalities, but the fear of being overwhelmed is oftentimes what a child feels when there's a tremendous critical or negative or commanding, demanding force. So the child is basically defending their own identity. They're pushing back, they're creating some little space in which they can develop. So that it's always important to understand that in this multi-layered approach, that what you see as the withdrawal is really the surface behavior for a lot of complicated feelings. And it's through inquiry you can actually begin to understand and feel those, and the withdrawing person ideally would begin to speak about those. And I call that self-disclosure. So let's look at the pursuing person for a moment. So their behavior is usually couched in, I'm just asking how he's doing, how she's doing, right? It tends to sound very neutral, but the basis of all of the 4 strategies is some kind of anxiety or fear usually. So if the fear over here is the fear of being overwhelmed, generally the fear of the pursuing person is the fear of abandonment. These are the 2 core feelings that the two of us in my own body, mind, wrestle with all the time. So let's say a little bit about the pursuing. Why is the person pursuing? Well, yes, on one hand, they're pursuing because they want to make that connection, and that's a loving position. Just as the idea that this person would have some space to develop their own consciousness, their own passion, their own career, that's a good thing, right? But when couples get locked into that, the pursuing person is feeling anxious. They're feeling like, oh, he never connects with me. Oh, he never wants to. She never wants to connect with me. So they're feeling something over on this side like loneliness, rejection, not feeling good about themselves, all the things that can happen when a person feels abandoned. They feel unloved and undeserving. And again, most of these patterns don't start with the primary relationship. So what we've got here is these deep internal training programs, which you see in behavior. And there's a lot more that could be said about the pursuing and withdrawing. I'm kind of trying to hit the high points and help people see that they really usually relate to core injuries or core trainings having to do with, can I create my own identity, and am I loved as I am? So when I've gotten caught up in either of these patterns, which I've done, when I apply consciousness in that moment, I try to become more self-revealing. I try to say, oh, I'm feeling lonely now, rather than ask that often anger-loaded or blame-loaded question, why don't you ever want to connect with me? Now, that's not very inviting, right? That kind of tone. So it's always my belief that self-disclosure is one of the main tools that we can use in these kinds of patterns that we get into. And of course, that requires some self-analysis. And the other thing, of course, is just taking a simple timeout. Our parents were like, count to 10, take a deep breath. That's still good information, because these patterns get started on bang, 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 bang. And the drawer and the pursuer say the same predictable things over and over. So what I've done very quickly, people have sent in these great questions about how to break the patterns. And so what I'm touching is just the possibilities here of inquiry, meditation, compassion, time out, all of which can help relieve some of the bad feelings which are at the core of these two patterns, which are really about anxiety. And what happens when you can change those patterns, which is a wonderful accomplishment of using those tools regularly and systematically for a long period of time, is that you start to feel more at ease, more love, more compassion, more joy. And that's the point of spiritual practice.